Here, is it locked or anything? I could just put it here. Okay.
Yeah, that's good. We are in the middle.
Okay. Yeah.
Get my revenge one day. I'm sure I'll be able to find a way of putting you in the spot.
Thank you to those that have stuck around with us for this long. I have a very easy request. If you could please all move up. This is a fireside chat and we want it to be a little bit more intimate. So if we could get everybody to move up, and you can even sit at the reserve tables that were reserved earlier in the day. Great.
Can you hear us already?
I don't think they haven't turned us on yet, but they have.
So this is a water security in the Gulf conference. And of course, we had to have a panel that included an archaeologist, an art historian, and also a GUQ grad. So I've been really looking forward to this panel. Of course, all of the day's sessions have been amazing, but this one is really special because we don't typically get to share the stage or share the same conference with people that are in such different fields. And speaking, as kind of when I would go to science conferences, or if you go to a science conference or a policy conference, it tends to be very, very much focused on people from those areas as well. But we felt that this was a very important topic because we started out the day talking about the perspective, the historical perspective of water management in the region, and that cultural stewardship is very fundamental to, and that history is very fundamental to how we move forward. So I'm going to pass it over to our wonderful moderator. Sheikha Nouf Al-Thani is the head of strategic insights at the chairperson's office at Qatar Museums, and she'll be leading us through this fireside chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to this insightful panel discussion on water, stewardship, Islam, and cultural heritage. This has been an extraordinary day so far, and I'm sure this panel will be no different. As we navigate the intricate tapestry of the Gulf's history and culture, our distinguished panelists will illuminate the historical perspectives around culture and surrounding water stewardship in the region. We aim to explore not only the challenges posed by water security, but also the collaborative efforts that can weave a sustainable future while honoring the rich legacy of this region. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleagues from Qatar Museums, Dr. Robert Carter and Dr. Julia Gonnella. Dr. Carter works for Qatar Museums and specializes in the archaeology, history, and heritage of Qatar and the region, as well as pearl fishing. Among his books is Sea of Pearls, 7,000 Years of Industry That Shaped the Gulf. His current research project with Qatar Museums is exploring the early Islamic period sites of Qatar. Dr. Carter was previously based at UCL Qatar, where his major research project, The Origins of Doha and Qatar, combined archaeology, historical research, GIS, architectural studies, and oral histories to explore the development of Doha and Qatar. Dr. Carter holds a PhD in Bronze Age Eastern Arabia and an MA from UCL Institute of Archaeology, London. Dr. Julia is the director of the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, where she is responsible for the museum's full leadership, formative management, and programming. Recently, Dr. Gonnella oversaw the comprehensive rehaul of the museum in preparation for the World Cup Qatar 2022. This involved a full rehang of the galleries, adopting a new museological approach that allows for a deeper understanding of the rich Islamic heritage and culture. If you have not visited the Museum of Islamic Art yet, I urge you to do so, and I know many of you will be going this evening, yes. Dr. Gonnella earned both her BA in Islamic Art and Archaeology and MA in Social Anthropology at the School of Oriental and African Art in London. She received her PhD from the Eberhard Karls University in Germany. Before joining MIA, Dr. Gonnella worked at the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin, where she oversaw many exhibitions and research projects. This is an interesting one. One of her principal research interests focused on the citadel of Aleppo, where she has been excavating for over 10 years.
Yeah.
Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
As we know, the region continues to face great challenges in the area of water security. Dr. Carter, can you start us off by giving us a historical perspective of water, its importance and uses in Qatar and the broader region?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the very nice introduction, Sheikha Nouf, and thank you everyone for being here. And at the end of the day, that's great. The topic we're talking about, of course, is central to Qatari society and history, and the history of the region, because, as we know, it's in global terms an extremely arid area, so water supplies are extremely important for human survival. It's very much a story of different solutions for different places, because actually Arabia is very variable in terms of its geography, its geology, and its hydrology. In Qatar, for example, you don't get abundant supplies of groundwater, and there isn't the hydrostatic pressure, the deep aquifers with pressurized aquifers that push water to the surface. Also, there's very low rainfall, and you don't get high relief. You don't get mountains which trap water and trap the rainfall and pool them in certain areas. So it's very much been a case of well-based survival in Qatar throughout time, pretty much. These wells, of course, can only be dug a certain depth to be viable using traditional technologies. You know, you could go deeper, but most of the ones in Qatar traditionally were 6 or 7 meters deep, sometimes a little bit more. What's more, this water is rain-fed. It comes from the annual rainfall, which is quite low, so it can run out very quickly. So there had to be a great deal of water husbandry. People had to be careful how they used it. And for this reason, for most of Qatar's history and prehistory, agriculture has been very limited. And I'll come back to that, because that's not the whole story. In other places, different places have different geography and therefore different solutions. So, for example, in Bahrain, you get these aquifers bubbling out which are fed by rainfalls in Saudi Arabia as far away as the Hijaz, and eventually under pressure, this is ancient rainfall, it used to bubble up in Bahrain, and you were able to channel that or run it through underground channels into the field. So there was a constant stream of deep aquifer water, which allowed a relatively abundant agriculture. Bahrain was famous for its gardens, its villages, and its date palms. In Oman, you have the mountains, and these trap water, they create rainfall, and they trap water in the wadi systems and the gravel beds, which again is tapped by very advanced technologies of horizontal wells, known as falaj or qanat, depending on where you're from, which then again would feed constantly the agricultural plots for which Oman was famous and still is. In fact, many of these falaj, aflaj is the plural, many of them are still running. They require a lot of maintenance, they require a lot of technology, a technology that was actually developed in Oman. We used to think it was an Iranian technology. The Iranians are very proud of originating it, but actually the oldest examples we have, about 600 years older than any Iranian ones we know about, are found in the Iron Age settlements of Oman. I don't know if there's any Omanis here, but you should be proud of yourselves. We think it might have been developed from Iron Age mining technology, but that's another story. Here in Qatar, though, as I said, agriculture was not widely practiced, because simply if you drew too much water from these wells, you would run out of it very quickly in a localized level and have to move. You wouldn't have to move very far, but you'd have to go somewhere else. What agriculture did occur, and we only know of 6, maybe 7 agricultural plots at the beginning of the 20th century, were in very small areas. They were usually garden plots used by the sheikhs. So it was as much a matter of prestige and status as it was to actually produce produce. They weren't very productive. The soil's not great. It required a lot of labor. If you overexploited it, you'd run out of water. But we know where these garden areas were. And my own field, archaeology, contributes 2 or 3 more that we know were active in the 18th and 19th century, all of them in the north of Qatar. Apart from that, the desert was occupied, but by nomads who did not farm. Now, I should probably stop talking. Have I talked too long already?
No, you're good.
I'll keep
A couple
going.
more minutes.
I'll keep going.
I think everyone's enjoying this.
So I'll move back in time. For 1,000 years before the 18th century, we have a mostly nomadic occupation of Qatar. We don't have the coastal towns and settlements which came with the pearl fishery. We have, again, desert occupation, which is hard for us to see archaeologically, of people clustered around these depressions in the desert that we call Rawda, or Riyadh is the plural. These are very important. And what's interesting is in the early Islamic period, between, let's say, the 7th and the 10th centuries, or 7th and 9th centuries of the Christian era, we see villages turning up around these depressions. So not only were they the place that the Bedouin camped for most of Qatari history and prehistory, but for this 200 or 300 years, we get villages, and we're just starting to get evidence from my archaeological excavations, which are running now, that these guys were actually farming. And there's a lot of these sites around a lot of these depressions. So clearly something was different then. We don't know if it's because the climate was different, or maybe higher sea level had pushed up the groundwater table, or maybe there was just more of a social and economic impetus for farming. People can adapt according to the conditions, according to what is needed.
Yeah.
If we go to the other end of the scale, in the 1950s, drilling technology was introduced and diesel pumps. And so you get very, very many more farms turning up in these silty depressions, firstly around Doha, but actually then across the whole of Qatar. And again, since the blockade, there have been many more. So now farming is actually quite common, whereas in the past it was not.
Thank you. And then maybe on that note, Dr. Julia, you can tell us a little bit more about the Islamic history aspect. So are there objects in Islamic art that can tell a story of water, maybe as a like Dr. Robert just said, along the ideas of the Canals or the transfer of water and travel and so on. So maybe looking at pilgrimage and looking at how people would travel from the greater region of maybe what is modern-day Syria and Iraq to Najd and so on.
Well, to start with, hello. Also, thank you so much, Sheikha Nouf, for introducing, and thank you for being here. This is the biggest fireside place I've ever seen, actually. It's very intimate. I'm working at the Museum of Islamic Art, and because we have the expo at the moment, we started this water trail with our research assistants at the museum. We looked for objects. You see, we'd like to find storylines within the museum to make it interesting for people and not just see, a pot or a vase or a bowl or a pen. This gave us an interesting, opportunity to think about water, and water, not only the objects, but water in general, water in Islamic culture. And in fact, of course, we know that, especially this part of the world, water plays a major role. I mean, long before Islam, and water is there for people to drink, to survive, to feed their animals, and also to have agriculture. In fact, agriculture is only one part. Yeah. Of course, the agriculture is an important part, and I think especially in this larger part of the world, we have some of our earliest civilizations, near the rivers, the big cities of Ur and Babylon, or in Egypt. And then you see there are different ways. They can only exist because they somehow managed to work with the water. But to look into the Islamic culture and into Islam, that's also very interesting, because water just plays an overriding role for the religion, and with repercussions for everyday life, because of course it's not only religion, it's really, Islam is something which covers, everything. And there are three aspects I'd like to mention which are particularly important, because as a basic, it's mentioned in the Quran as it's been given to human, and it's really the one that gives life. So the aspect of mercy is extremely important. I find this extremely interesting, and especially in today's life, because we take water for granted. But I think you have to be careful about the water and how you use the water, and that's an interesting aspect. So the other aspect, of course, there is for hygiene, for water, because obviously you need to clean yourself. You need to clean yourself before praying. That's very well known. You have the ablutions, you have the small and the large one. You clean yourself before you have food and after you have food. So that's something, you know, you have quite a few objects in our museum because they are basins for ablution, you know, before the food. So if you come to the museum tonight, you can see some of them. But that's also, it's, you know, it's not only cleaning from, how can I say, it's not only cleaning from just being clean, but it's also, it's a spirit, there is a spiritual part of it, you know, you clean of the sins. So there is this balance between, you know, impurity, purity, that's extremely important. And lastly, there is another, I don't answer all your questions, I know, but there, I think it's very important for the basic. And the last one is, so yes, the culture of Islam has all these baths, you know, the hammamat, you know, small ones, big ones, and this is something even I learned in school back in Germany, you know, in the Middle East, in the Muslim cultures, they had all these baths, while in Europe, everything was still dirty and they only used perfume. You see, so this is, you know, it's true, but they have all these baths, no?
Yeah.
It's amazing. So, and the last thing, which is also very essential, is connected, is the charity. You should never leave someone thirsty. You should give out the water, yeah? And so there is another aspect in Islamic culture which is probably as often as you have bath, is you have fountains or water tanks to attend to the traveler, and that of course comes to the pilgrimage. You know, you either have wells for the pilgrim to go some, you know, in this case particularly to Mecca, of course, or you have fountains for people to drink. You need bottles to take the water along, obviously, but the charity aspect, you should always, you know, you should never leave someone thirsty. And I think one of the earliest battles in Islam actually is talking about the story, which is the story of the army of Ali, of course, in Karbala, who were left thirsty, and the Umayyad Caliph left them alone. So, you know, so it's a very big topic.
Yeah, thank you. So, Dr. Julia talks about the transfer of water, and you spoke, Dr. Carter, about Canals and Sabil and all these different ways that water was transferred and transported within the region. My question here is, what are those innovative mechanisms that the region so in need of water and being so scarce? What are those mechanisms that they used in your archaeological research that you found, and how were they transported throughout the region and globally, which I know they have been?
Yeah, well, water transport was extremely important. I'll let Dr. Julia talk about technologies that were particularly useful in places like Iraq and Syria. And I'll talk a little bit about this region. I mentioned, of course, the Qanat or the Falaj and the channels in Bahrain, but there's other ways of doing it as well. So in certain areas, especially on the Persian side, you have very, very large cisterns for trapping rainwater, most famously on the island of Qais or Kish, where there's very extensive underground cisterns on an island which had virtually no water supply of its own. And the same is true on the island of Jaroun or Hormuz. They had to basically harbor and catch as much runoff as they could. This, of course, is essential. But actually, people could bring water by long distances by boat. Not just to supply, for example, the pearling fleets or people at sea, where they would take a tank called a fantas and fill it with water and then ship it out to the sailors, but also to supply the townspeople as well. So a variety of different kinds of people, if you like, would gather water from the wells. In the case of Doha, the best water supplies were about 4 miles out of town. And you could either go and get it yourself from the wells, or you could buy it off a kandari, a water supplier. And so there was a constant stream of people going in between the various well sites around Doha and the town, just to keep the town alive. In other places, they would bring it in much larger quantities inside these water tanks from underwater springs, for example. There's an underwater spring off Bahrain, These were called Kawkab. They were very important, they were very powerful. And the town of Mubarak was entirely, which was the second or third biggest town in the Gulf, incidentally, was entirely supplied from one underwater spring, where people would fill skins underwater and again ship them into town constantly to feed the population. In Kuwait, they would bring water in from the Shatt al-Arab. They would fill these water tanks and bring them again daily in to feed the town of Kuwait, which was the largest town in the Gulf, because there wasn't enough groundwater locally. You exhaust it, it goes salty. Likewise, in a place like Doha, you were constantly having to dig new wells because the old field would be exhausted. And this is where it gets interesting, because like, who's doing the digging, who's good at doing the engineering? Many of the wells and the well sites, not all of them, but many of them are known after people who might have been the people who sponsored the digging or paid for the well to be dug and lined, or they were named after families or tribes who would have been the ones who, if you like, had custodianship. I won't say ownership, but custodianship of the well within their territory, and if you like, had primacy of use. And other groups, this is particularly important for the Bedouin groups inland, of course, other groups would use those wells only by agreement or on sufferance of the tribe that had custodianship of it. And again, this gets into matters of customary law and stuff and things which I don't know much about, so I don't want to say too much about it. But water was very much, I wouldn't say owned, but managed. And you had to manage it the right way, or A, there wouldn't be enough, or B, somebody would start shooting at you because, you know, you're taking it from somebody else. And as for the much larger scale towns and rural agrarian farming societies in Syria and Iraq, I think I'd better leave that to Julia, because...
yeah, well, as far as I know, no, but of course the system of the canals is very famous. Some of the canals also from pre-Islamic periods.
Yeah.
No, I mean I think the canals in Iraq, especially, they go back long before. The Qanat in Iran, very old, and I think they were, as far as I know, built by actually special people. They knew how to do mining
and the dams
people, no?
as well.
Yeah. So what you had to really build, they were cut in the rock, and you need mountains, of course, and then the water goes down, and then they have these holes in between where they can take the water out, and you see the water slowly goes down, but without losing a lot of, it has to be very carefully set, because if it's too steep, the water goes away too quickly. So, and if you have a village or a town at one of these canals, you better live at the upper side where the water is still fresh, and leave the agriculture more to the southern side, to the lower side. So that's extremely important. Then you have, of course, very famous for Syria, but also Spain. It was introduced, in fact, from the Middle East. The Naura, the water wheel in Hama, you can still see it. You see it's so for this you need a current, a river. So you bring up the water, and then it goes into canals, and then. Last but not least, there is the one with the animal.
The one that turns. Yeah, I don't know what that's
with the animal,
called,
I think this is in Egypt, for example, they have that a lot. And then you have the bucket system, I think.
The Shadouf.
The Shadouf. But what is also interesting is that there was a lot of research done in, on agriculture, back in the 10th, 11th, 12th century. And obviously, I learned this myself now in preparation, there is this special technique, and I forgot how it was called, when you have different rotations, this rotation, the other rotation. And it was actually an invention in the Middle East from Arab engineers, setting up these kind of, how you see, like the fountains, basically. Yeah. So that's really, it has a name. I know it in German, but I can't remember it in English. But they wrote books on this, you see. So that's also really interesting.
Yeah. I just want to remind the audience that the QR code's on your tables for any questions. I have a question here from the audience that I'm going to jump to, if you don't mind. So we've spoken about historical aspects of water and water stewardship in the region. I think this question is more contemporary, and the question is, what are some ways Qatar can raise awareness about the importance of water security within its Islamic community and beyond its borders?
You want to take that one?
No, you start.
I can start. Well, I think, I mean, this is not, if you like, this is an obvious thing to say, but education and awareness raising is crucial, and somebody needs to say it, and they need to say it publicly in ways that people will hear, which might mean using social media and things these days and having public campaigns run through social media. I think if people are made aware of how scarce water is here and how reliant everybody in Qatar is on desalinated water, which is a vulnerable resource, then they might think about it, more carefully and maybe try and conserve water. I mean, because I'm an archaeologist and to a certain extent a historian, I can't help but take a historical perspective. So I personally am always very aware of how little there was and is. And I'm not really sure if that message would get through to the wider population. I think maybe have to be phrased in a different way. But I think as long as people know that water is precious, even if it appears to be in abundance. I mean, there's a change of mindset that happened when piped water was introduced. In the 1950s, they started putting standpipes in the street. And up to that point, because you had to pay for your water, and it was relatively expensive for people who didn't have a great deal of money at the time, you would get your tin of water or your jar of water, and that would have to be for the whole family, for drinking, and cooking for the whole day or longer. So you were very careful with it, and any dirty water you had, you would feed the little bush that you had in your yard for shade if you had one, and of course we'll give it to your goat or even your cow. Many families had cows, which take a lot of water. You had a well usually in your household, but that only produced salty water for washing. So people were very careful, and then the mindset changes completely the moment somebody puts a standpipe in the street and you turn the tap and it's gushing water. Because suddenly water ceases to be this incredibly precious resource. And then once you get water in your own home, which doesn't happen very long afterwards in some areas, if you like, that whole tradition of very, very careful stewardship and awareness of water can evaporate, not within a lifetime, but within seconds, I would guess, because suddenly it's as if the heavens have opened and you're surrounded by something in superabundance that previously used to be extremely rare. So that mindset has changed forever, but maybe awareness of what it was like before piped water came might help. I mean, or maybe I just like thinking about the past. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there are, I think actually in the Islamic scriptures there are a lot of, using wastewater, for example. You see, there are discussions on this, whether because normally for the ablution or so, you're only allowed to have clean water, or for drinking, of course, you also want clean water, but then you also have wastewater. So I think there are quite a lot of discussions on this, and I think you can start on this, definitely, how you use the water. And then, of course, you have all the technology, I have to say that, all single, the canals and the fountains, I think they can give rise to a lot of ideas.
I think that the poetry and the religious literature would actually help a lot, bringing that to...
The poetry?
Yeah, the poetry about the fountains and all this.
Yeah, but how does it help to save water?
Because it would help popularize, or at least help bring people's attention to matters related to water. And maybe a fountain's not the best way to conserve water. I'm not sure.
Could we, on that note, can we associate the evolution of complex Islamic or Arab societies, be it those around poetry or arts or literature and all of that, to be around water and areas with abundance of water?
Well, there's a hydraulic theory of civilization, which is a little bit old-fashioned now, but it's still valid for many people, and I think there's some strength in it. The idea that if you do have to undertake large-scale engineering operations in order to guarantee enough food for all your people, then it will require more administration and more complexity and more government, if you like, which leads to a bureaucratic state. And that in turn produces more food and more people, and it becomes a kind of positive feedback where population size and social complexity grow together, because you need to build an enormous dam and then manage it, or you need to build a vast canal running from one river 50 kilometers across the landscape to feed a city which is running dry because a stream has naturally changed its course or something. So there's that. I'm not very well, personally, I'm not very knowledgeable about cultural complexity when it comes to water, because I don't have Arabic literature and arts, at the forefront of my research. But I'm sure it's important.
A question from the audience, Dr. Julia.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on some of the Islamic heritage lessons about careful stewardship of water resources?
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
And can you elaborate on Islamic teachings of water stewardship, maybe through Islamic art or through archaeological work?
On sewage, Sewage is as important as, bringing
not
water.
Sewage, not sewage.
Oh, no, it's part of the story of water, though. I mean,
kidding.
I sat through a good conversation about sewage upstairs earlier this afternoon.
Well, it is actually important, and again, it's very carefully done. And for example, from our work on the citadel of Aleppo, so you have, which is on a tell, on a hill on the top. So you have the citadel. Obviously, the citadel was something before, so it's very old, and there were these cisterns on the top of the mountain to collect the rainwater. And then they built under the Ayyubids, they built this system of two different kinds of canals out of the citadel. One was the rainwater, which then went down in the system because there was a ditch around it with the water, so they had the fresh water, and then they had one for sewage, which would go outside, not to go in the ditch, because that would produce obviously, you have bacteria and so on, so it's very dangerous. So people actually, or rulers, not people, rulers who were managing large cities took a lot of they were very careful in building their systems, not all of them, but some of them. And I think the Islamic cities, the big ones, the famous ones, are all have an amazing systems, also in Iran, in Iraq, for sure in Syria. And this is one way. And also with the wells, for example, if you have a well and then you need the latrine, which you should ideally not have next to it, because otherwise it goes down in the groundwater. So that's sort of the easier way in the villages, probably. Yeah.
And when looking at managing water resources, do you see a drastic difference in cultural heritage or cultural practices across the region when looking at the Gulf versus maybe Iraq and Syria region?
Well, I would say there's huge differences because of the different availability of water, but also how it arrives. So in the case of Iraq and Syria and certain other parts, it's coming in very large quantities for some of the year down the river system, but it's surrounded, especially in central Iraq, by very arid desert areas. So it's a matter of how do you tap and manage that water to bring it to where it's needed into agricultural areas or to feed populations, whether they're in the town or the countryside. And then at certain times of year, of course, there's not so much water coming out of those systems. So how do you cope when the water levels are low? Once the snow melt has finished and the water levels have dropped, the water levels are lower. So you have to tap that water in a different way compared to how it was when the river levels were high. And then, I mean, at the beginning, I already sort of mentioned a little bit about how Qatar is different from surrounding regions. You know, different areas have to have different solutions. Also, you have very different population sizes. So, because the agricultural potential, for example, in southern Iraq is so high, there's always been very, very large populations. So they've had to have different solutions to water management, consumption and disposal. And again, there's very specific things that happen in certain places. So there's a flood. There used to be a flood every year, rather like the Nile, but there used to be a flood every year in the far south of Iraq, which still happens, but to a lesser degree. And then you would plant your barley on top of it, on the soil, as soon as the floodwaters had receded, and then you had a rain-fed crop, which you could also irrigate, but it definitely got a kick-start from the floodwaters. Of course, we don't get that here. We do get pooling. You know, everyone's seen what happens when it rains in Qatar, right? It's like suddenly lakes appear all over the place. And it's not just in Doha. I mean, I'm sure we'd all like to blame Ashghal or somebody, you know, but in fact you can't. If you go out to the countryside, it happens there as well. All of these depressions fill up with water.
No.
It's Qatar's topography. It's flat. It's because the place is flat. There's nowhere for it to go, so it just goes into any depression. Yeah. On the other hand, those don't usually last very long, those water supplies. So they're not part of everyday management or even regular. It's unpredictable. It might not rain one year, or it might only rain in one area. So you can't rely on there being a lake there every year. So again, different solutions are required.
Yeah. So just to be conscious of time, I have one more question for each of you, and it's a little fun one. So if you can tell me, I'll start with you, Dr. Carter. If you can tell me your most favorite archaeological site here in Qatar, the north and the west and the south, and how it relates to water, in your opinion. And Dr. Julia asked the same question, but about our collections.
About?
Our collections.
Yeah, good.
Okay, my favorite water-related site.
Everyone's ready to quote you, just letting you know.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's fine, because I mean, I've actually already mentioned, I've mentioned it. So we've been trying to get to the bottom of why there's all these sites during the earliest, these villages that popped up inland during the early Islamic period and then disappeared again. And as I say, there's various solutions. So my favorite water-related site at the moment is the one we're excavating right now, because it's just started to produce evidence that can explain why there were people there. I mean, not the whole story, and it's still very early, so forgive me if I change my mind in a publication in 3 years' time, but it looks as though they were trying to farm, or they were managing to farm. But then, of course, that needs explaining. There's no end to questions in archaeology. Once you explain one thing, it just raises more questions. So in this case, okay, so they were farming, but why were they farming then when they weren't farming before, and when they weren't farming, at least hardly at all, afterwards? Which, of course, we're trying to answer with various scientific studies of climate and soils and hydrology and stuff like that. Yeah, I would have to say at the moment it's a site called Ain Mohammed Nouf, close to Zubarah, where we're just getting these little bits of archaeobotanical evidence, so little bits of burnt wheat husk that show that, not that they were just buying in grains, which you can buy anyway from abroad, but actually growing their own.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Bit technical, but still.
Okay. I look for a beautiful object, and you'll see it when you go to Mia tonight. My favorite piece, obviously, is the Hind. This is our fountainhead, and this is something we haven't touched upon at all, as the gardens, which are a little bit the paradise on earth, which are created with the water. And the Hind was part of a fountain in Al-Andalus in Spain, early period from Spain. It's beautifully decorated, and when you look, you can even see the tube where the water came. We changed this in our new installation, so you can actually see it. It's really an impressive piece, and it reminds us of these beautiful fountains, of course in Al-Andalus, but everywhere else. And I think the Islamic gardens are, one of the most famous gardens in the world history. In Iran or in Spain or really everywhere. It's, you know, people really try with the little water they have to produce paradise on earth. I think that's very impressive.
Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you everyone for sticking around so late. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was amazing. And I just, you were pointing to me when you were talking about the gardens in Iran. And when we were speaking last week, I said something about nature-based solutions and, oh, you know, in the region. And you said, oh, yeah, okay, Esfahan, Iran, that must be, yeah. So that's the connection. Thank you. And I just want to make a quick announcement. So we do have the reception this evening at the Museum of Islamic Art. There will be buses that will leave from the hotel lobby, so please join us. And the buses will start leaving at 7 o'clock. Yes, 7 o'clock. And between 7 and 7:30, we expect everyone to arrive. So if you want to drive separately, you're welcome to. See you there. Thank you.